Now, we did the use of a gerund. The gerund acts like a subject of a verb, object of a verb, complement of a verb, or object of a preposition. We saw it. Now, let us look at the distinction, that's the difference between the infinitive and gerund. How will you detect infinitive? How will you identify gerund? So now we're going to look at the distinction between an infinitive and a gerund. A gerund is partly a noun and partly a verb and ends in good ing. So gerund is ending in ing, doing the work of partly a verb and partly a noun. But in the case of an infinitive, is partly a noun and partly a verb and usually used by adding to. That's the difference. Gerund ends in ing and that verb partly does the work of a verb and partly it acts like the noun. In the case of an infinitive, it also does the partly work of a noun, partly work of a verb, and the infinitive is formed by adding to the verb. To play, to cry, to go. To. That's all we need to remember. To the verb. In many sentences, a gerund can replace the infinitive. In many times in the sentence, the gerund, it can replace an infinitive, okay, without changing the meaning. You can replace without changing the meaning of the sentence. Now let us look at the examples. Okay. So what did we say? Gerund ends in ing, use the work of a verb and a noun. The infinitive is formed by adding to the verb. And then it does partly the work of a noun, partly the work of a verb. Now, examples with the gerund, how it is, with the infinitive, how, that's what we're going to look at. Let's look at the examples. The distinction between, the difference between, what are we doing? The distinction. Between an infinitive and infinitive and a gerund. That's what we are looking at now. What is the distinction between the infinitive and the gerund? Okay? Now look at the examples. We are looking at examples in the case of with gerund. With gerund. Then with infinitive. So look at the examples differently to understand better. So we are talking about examples with gerund, with infinitive. Okay, that's what we're going to look at. First, I like cooking. When you say I like cooking, yeah, the gerund is cooking. The word here, I said in gerund we use ing. But in the case of infinitive, we add to the verb. Okay? So here, I like cooking, but in the infinitive, the example will be I like to cook. I like to cook. See the difference. Okay? Here we'll say I like cooking. When it comes to infinitive, you say I like to cook. You add to. Let's look at another example. She taught me driving. She taught me driving. And here, so driving. In this case, you add ing for the gerund infinitive. To the verb, you add to. So, what will that be? She taught me to drive. She taught me to drive. In the infinitive, you add to the verb. So, to cook, to drive. See the difference. Next, seeing is believing. Seeing is believing. Here, seeing is believing. So, believing. Okay, believing. In gerund, believe, believing. So, what will be here? To see is to believe. To see. To see is. To believe is to believe. In the case of the infinitive, to believe. The verb, now, I told you, both, we are talking at the distinct and difference between the infinitive and gerund. In both the cases, whether it's infinitive or gerund, the verb does the work of a noun and partly does the work of a verb. In the case of infinitive, the verb is formed. You add to the verb to make it infinitive. But in the case of gerund, it's always you add ing to the verb, but still the verb does partly the work of a noun, partly the work of a verb. Actually, there isn't much difference between the gerund and the infinitive. Sometimes you can use one for the other without making much changes. Here, examples of distinction between the infinitive and gerund. Now, in the gerund, you say, I like cooking, ing. She taught me driving, and the verb ends in ing. Seeing is believing, it ends in ing. The same thing, I like cooking, but in the infinitive, only for the verb, instead of ing, you add to the infinitive. I like cooking. There isn't much difference between the two. I like to cook. She taught me driving. She taught me to drive. There isn't difference. Seeing is believing. To see is to believe. So when you form the infinitive, you add to the verb. Okay? And that's it.